Seo Joon-Seok sat in the center of the Dragon's Lounge, the scent of expensive bourbon and tobacco clinging to his sharp black suit. Around him, enforcers stood like shadows, their neck tattoos catching the dim light. The world outside feared this room, but inside, it was a silent machine of power. That silence shattered when the heavy doors groaned open. A 6-year-old girl in a pleated school uniform and a light cardigan stood there, her small frame swallowed by the opulence. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. Instead, she walked toward the center of the room with a terrifying, practiced silence, a child who had learned that being heard was dangerous. Joon-Seok lowered his glass, his cold eyes tracking the scuffed school shoes. When she reached his table, she didn't ask for money or mercy. She simply knelt, unzipped a small, faded backpack, and pulled out a worn teddy bear and a stack of blood-stained papers. "My father is coming," she whispered, her downcast eyes fixed on Joon-Seok's tattooed hands. "I have his secrets. If I give them to you, can I stay behind you?" In that moment, the predator felt something he hadn't felt in decades, a protective rage. He didn't see a witness. He saw a mirror of a childhood he'd spent a lifetime trying to bury. The silence in the Dragon's Lounge was a physical thing, heavy and pressurized, usually reserved for the quiet distribution of territory or the sentencing of a traitor. When the heavy mahogany doors had first groaned open, Seo Joon-Seok's enforcers had reacted with the synchronized tension of wolves. Hands had drifted toward the waistbands of tailored trousers. Eyes had sharpened into slits. But as the small figure in the scuffed school shoes stepped into the amber light, the air in the room shifted from lethal to bewildered. Ella Morgan did not look like a girl who had lost her way. She walked with a stiff, metronomic precision, her gaze fixed neither on the glinting chandeliers nor the massive men who stood like statues of obsidian along the walls. To the enforcers, her lack of fear was more unsettling than a scream would have been. They were men who traded in the currency of terror, yet this child bypassed their shadows as if they were nothing more than furniture. Park, Joon-Seok's most volatile lieutenant, took a half-step forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. He was a man who could make seasoned debtors weep with a single look, but as he towered over the girl, she didn't even flinch. She didn't look up to see the jagged scar trailing down his jaw or the coldness in his eyes. Instead, she adjusted the strap of her backpack, her knuckles white against the fabric. She had spent 6 years living with a predator who wore a smile and a necktie. The men in this room, with their obvious weapons and dark suits, were honest by comparison. To Ella, the monsters here were stationary and visible, not like the one at home who moved through the hallways like a ghost. Joon-Seok watched her from his chair, his glass of bourbon forgotten on the coaster. He saw the way she didn't scan the room for an exit, but rather for the center of power. When she finally reached the edge of his table, the weight of her backpack seemed to pull her small shoulders downward, a physical manifestation of a burden no child should carry. "You're the boss," she said. It wasn't a question. Her voice was thin like parchment, but it didn't tremble. Joon-Seok leaned forward, the leather of his chair creaking in the stillness. "I am." "Then you're the only one who can keep a promise," she whispered. With a slow, deliberate motion, she shrugged the backpack off. It hit the marble floor with a dull, heavy thud, a sound that suggested it contained far more than just notebooks and crayons. As she reached for the zipper, the enforcers moved instinctively closer, but Joon-Seok raised a single, tattooed hand. He was no longer looking at his men. He was looking at the girl's downcast eyes, realizing that for Ella, this lounge wasn't a place of danger. It was the only fortress she had left. Joon-Seok pushed back his chair, the heavy legs scraping against the marble floor like a low growl. The men around the perimeter of the room shifted, their shadows lengthening as the boss did something they had never seen. He descended. He didn't just lean forward. He moved out from behind the fortress of his desk and knelt, his tailored trousers creasing, until he was eye to eye with the girl. Up close, The tattoos on his neck looked like armor, but his expression had smoothed into a mask of terrifying focus. "Show me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly frequency that only she was meant to hear. Ella's small, pale fingers gripped the zipper of her backpack. The sound of the plastic teeth parting was sharp in the absolute silence of the lounge. First, she reached in and pulled out a teddy bear. It was a pathetic thing, one ear hanging by a thread, its fur matted and gray from years of being squeezed too tight. She held it for a heartbeat, a silent goodbye to the only comfort she had ever known, before placing it on the floor between them. "This is Barnaby," she whispered. "He's for the trouble of it." Joon-Seok didn't smile. He didn't mock the offering. He looked at the bear with the same gravity he would accord a shipment of gold. Then, Ella reached back into the bag. This time, her hand came out with a thick envelope, the edges frayed and secured with a rubber band that looked ready to snap. "These are the scary papers," she said, her voice finally wavering. "My father keeps them in the wall behind the picture of the bridge. He says if anyone sees them, he'll go away forever. I want him to go away forever." Joon-Seok took the envelope. He slid out the first few pages, and as his eyes scanned the ledger entries, the offshore account numbers, and the frantic, handwritten notes of a man who traded in human misery, his jaw set into a line of iron. He saw names he recognized, men who shook his hand in public while hiding daggers in the dark. But beneath the financial crimes lay the true horror. Polaroids tucked between the pages, snapshots of the monsters her father kept in his wake, and the visible evidence of the bruises Ella had hidden beneath her cardigan. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. It was no longer a business meeting. It was a transition into a state of war. Joon-Seok didn't look up, but the temperature in the lounge seemed to drop 10 degrees. "You did well to bring this to me, Ella," he said, his voice devoid of its usual coldness, replaced by a lethal promise. He stood up slowly, the envelope gripped in one hand and the teddy bear scooped up in the other. He looked at Park, his lead enforcer, who was already reaching for his phone. "The contract is signed," Joon-Seok announced to the room, his eyes never leaving the little girl who had just handed him a kingdom of secrets. "Now, call the others. We aren't just hiding her. We're erasing the reason she had to run." The back room of the Dragon's Lounge was a stark contrast to the velvet and amber warmth of the main floor. Here, the air was chilled by industrial cooling units and smelled of ozone and cold solder. Seo Joon-Seok stood in the center of the laboratory, the worn teddy bear still resting on a nearby workstation like a displaced refugee. Before him, 3 technicians sat in the blue glow of towering monitors, their fingers dancing across mechanical keyboards with a frantic, rhythmic clicking. At the center of the console lay the small, silver USB drive that had been tucked into the lining of Ella's backpack, a ghost that had lived in the machine of her father's life. "Boss, I've bypassed the initial encryption," one of the technicians whispered, his voice tight with disbelief. "This isn't just local graft. It's a network." A series of windows cascaded across the main screen, illuminating Joon-Seok's face in a ghostly pale light. He didn't blink as the data began to take shape. It was a digital map of a massive, silent conspiracy. There were spreadsheets detailing the systematic siphoning of public funds, shell companies registered in island nations he had never visited, and, most damningly, a series of encrypted logs that recorded favors bought and sold among the city's highest-ranking officials. Ella's father, a man the world saw as a mid-level bureaucrat, was actually the architect of a shadow bridge, a conduit through which the city's resources were being drained into the pockets of a hungry elite. "There's more," the lead analyst said, opening a hidden directory labeled with a simple, chilling string of numbers. "These are the insurance policies." He recorded the meetings. He didn't just work for these people. He was preparing to blackmail them if they ever turned on him. Audio files began to play, the voices distorted but recognizable. The city's police commissioner, a prominent senator, and several of Joon-Seok's own peripheral business rivals. They spoke of cleaning up messes, and removing obstacles with a casualness that made the air in the room feel even colder. Joon-Seok watched a video file flicker to life. It was a hidden camera feed from a study. He saw Ella's father, his face twisted into a mask of arrogance, laughing as he toasted to a successful disappearance. The man was a ghost in the machine of the law, moving through the gears of society while grinding people like Ella beneath them. He thinks he's invisible because he knows everyone's secrets, Joon-Seok said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He reached out and picked up the teddy bear, his thumb brushing over its missing eye. He thinks his leverage makes him untouchable. He turned to Park, who stood in the doorway, already waiting for the command. He made the mistake of leaving his leverage in a child's backpack. Gather the enforcers. We aren't going to just leak this. We're going to use his own bridge to bring his entire world down on top of him. The heavy glass doors of the Dragon's Lounge didn't creak when they opened this time. They hissed, displaced by the arrogant stride of a man who believed he owned the air he breathed. Thomas Morgan walked into the dim light with the polished confidence of a career predator. He wore an expensive wool coat and a look of practiced, paternal concern, a mask so seamless it might have fooled anyone who hadn't seen the digital ghost currently screaming from Joon-Seok's servers. Seo Joon-Seok didn't rise to meet him. He remained on the balcony of the mezzanine, partially obscured by the shadows of the velvet curtains, looking down at the lobby like a god watching a feverish ant. Beside him, Park stood motionless, his hand resting on the railing, his knuckles white. "I'm looking for my daughter," Thomas announced to the receptionist, his voice projecting a perfect blend of worry and authority. "She's an imaginative child. She might have wandered in here. She has a habit of making up stories when she's upset." Joon-Seok watched as Thomas adjusted his silk tie, his eyes darting around the room. The man wasn't looking for a lost child. He was hunting for a lost backpack. He was looking for the leverage that had slipped through his fingers. "He's good," Park whispered, his voice a low vibration of disgust. "He almost sounds like he cares." "The most dangerous monsters always sound like they care," Joon-Seok replied. He looked down at the teddy bear resting on the small table beside him. The child was currently asleep in a secure room 3 floors up, tucked into silk sheets that cost more than her father's car, guarded by 2 men who would die before letting a single hair on her head be touched. Below, Thomas Morgan's patience began to fray. The mask of the worried father slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a glimpse of the jagged, desperate ego underneath. "Listen to me," he snapped at the staff. "I'm a high-ranking official. If you are harboring a minor, the legal consequences will be. The legal consequences are the least of your concerns, Thomas." Joon-Seok's voice cut through the lobby like a razor through silk. Thomas froze, his head snapping upward. He squinted into the shadows of the mezzanine, trying to find the source of the authority that had just silenced him. Joon-Seok stepped into the light. He didn't look like a savior. He looked like the inevitable end of a long, dark road. He leaned over the railing, his tattooed hands visible for Thomas to see. "Your daughter isn't here," Joon-Seok lied, his voice terrifyingly calm. "But your ghost is. It's been talking to my technicians for the last hour, Thomas. And it has a very long, very bloody story to tell." The blood drained from Thomas Morgan's face, leaving him a sallow, sickly gray. The predator realized, too late, that he had walked out of the woods and into a furnace. He opened his mouth to retort, to threaten, to bluster, but the words died in his throat as the heavy doors behind him hissed shut, and 4 of Joon-Seok's enforcers stepped out of the shadows to block his exit. Joon-Seok descended the stairs with a predatory grace, his footsteps heavy and rhythmic against the marble. Thomas Morgan stood paralyzed in the center of the lobby, surrounded by 4 men who looked less like bodyguards and more like the walls of a closing tomb. The social execution had already begun before Joon-Seok even reached the bottom step. "You think power is found in ledgers and blackmailed secrets, Thomas," Joon-Seok said, his voice echoing in the vast, empty space. He pulled a sleek, encrypted tablet from his inner pocket and tapped the screen once. But power is actually the ability to make a man vanish while he's still standing right in front of you. On the monitors behind the bar, the evening news was interrupted by a scrolling ticker of leaked documents. In the sterile chill of the back room, the technicians had initiated a scorched earth protocol. Within seconds, the offshore accounts Thomas had spent a lifetime filling began to blink and zero out. The digital currency redirected into a trust fund that the man would never touch. The shell companies dissolved. The insurance policies he had held over the city's elite were sent directly to the very people they targeted, turning his former allies into a pack of starving wolves. Thomas's phone began to vibrate in his pocket, a frantic, buzzing hornet. Then another, and another. He reached for it with trembling hands, his face turning a ghostly, translucent white as he saw the alerts. His credentials had been revoked. His private files were trending on every major server in the district. The respectable mask he had worn was being shredded in real time. "You're not a father anymore," Joon-Seok whispered, leaning in so close that Thomas could smell the faint scent of bourbon on his breath. "You're not an official. You're not even a memory. By tomorrow morning, the people you serve will be the ones hunting you. I haven't fired a single bullet, yet you are already dead." Joon-Seok looked over Thomas's shoulder at Park, who stood waiting by the heavy doors. The enforcer stepped forward, handing Joon-Seok the worn teddy bear he had been holding. Joon-Seok took the toy, its matted fur a stark contrast to his luxury watch and the tattoos on his knuckles. "The girl asked me to hide her," Joon-Seok said, his eyes turning into chips of ice. "I realized I couldn't do that as long as you existed in her world. So, I've simply removed your world from hers." He gestured to the door. The enforcers stepped aside, no longer needing to restrain a man who had lost everything. Thomas Morgan looked out at the street, where the flashing lights of a dozen redirected lives were already beginning to converge. He was a ghost, stripped of his name and his armor, cast out into a city that now knew exactly what he was. Joon-Seok turned his back on the broken man and began to walk toward the elevator. He had a contract to finish and a little girl who finally needed to hear that the monsters were gone. The penthouse suite above the Dragon's Lounge was a cathedral of glass and silence, tucked far away from the city's grinding gears. In the center of the master bedroom, Ella sat on the edge of a bed so large and soft she looked like a small, stray petal caught in a snowdrift. For a long time, she simply stared at the door. It was a heavy slab of oak, but tonight, for the first time in her memory, the deadbolt remained retracted. There was no lock to turn because there was no one left to keep out. Outside in the hallway, the floorboards didn't groan under the weight of a predator. Instead, there was the low, steady murmur of Park and another enforcer, their voices hushed to a gravelly whisper. To the rest of the world, these were the sounds of a brewing storm, the voices of men who broke bones and resolved debts with lead. But to Ella, through the crack in the doorway, they were a lullaby. The occasional rhythmic clink of a tactical belt or the soft scuff of a heavy boot against the carpet signaled a barrier that her father could never breach. Seo Joon-Seok stood by the floor-to-ceiling window in the adjacent study, watching the city lights flicker like dying embers. He had discarded his suit jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark ink that spiraled down his forearms, dragons and thorns that marked a life of necessary cruelty. He heard the small, tentative footsteps behind him before he saw her. "The door is open," Ella whispered, standing in the pool of moonlight that spilled across the rug. Joon-Seok turned, his expression unreadable, though his eyes softened at the sight of her. She was still wearing her school cardigan, but her shoulders were no longer hunched as if waiting for a blow. "It will stay open," Joon-Seok promised. "No one enters that room unless you invite them. Not even me." Ella looked toward the hallway, where the shadow of Park's massive frame was visible through the frosted glass of the suite's entrance. "Are they staying all night?" "They're staying forever If you need them to, he replied. Ella nodded slowly, a small, weary movement. She reached in her pocket and pulled out the one thing she had kept, the worn teddy bear, Barnaby. She tucked it under her arm, and for the first time, her eyes didn't seek the corners of the room for a hiding place. She looked at the bed, then back at the man who had dismantled a kingdom for her. I think I can sleep now, she said. As she turned back toward the bedroom, Joon-Seok watched her go, a strange, heavy ache settling in his chest. He had spent his life building walls to keep the world out, but tonight he realized the greatest strength he possessed was the ability to hold a door open for a child who had finally stopped running. For the first time in his own dark history, the silence in the lounge didn't feel like a threat. It felt like peace. The rain began as a cold, needle-sharp drizzle, slicking the asphalt of the alleyway behind the Dragon's Lounge. Thomas Morgan looked like a man who had been hollowed out from the inside. His wool coat was stained, his silk tie crooked, and the frantic light in his eyes spoke of a predator who had finally realized he was the one in the snare. He had tried the precincts. They had turned him away with cold, knowing stares. He had tried his associates. Their phones were dead to him. He was halfway to the mouth of the alley when a black sedan glided into place, cutting off the light. The passenger door didn't open, but the window rolled down just enough to reveal a pair of eyes that held the weight of a cemetery. You're late for your flight, Thomas, Joon-Seok said, stepping out from the shadows of a recessed service entrance. He didn't have a weapon drawn. He didn't need one. The two enforcers flanking him, their silhouettes broad and immovable, were enough of a sentence. Thomas lunged forward, his voice a ragged, desperate rasp. You can't do this. I have rights. I'm a citizen, a father. You were a ghost the moment you let that girl believe the world was a place she had to hide from, Joon-Seok interrupted. He walked forward until he was inches from Thomas, the tattoos on his neck visible even in the dim street lamp glow. He looked at the man not with hatred, but with a clinical, freezing disdain. You spent years teaching Ella that monsters live in the dark, under the bed, and behind closed doors. You taught her that they look like the person who is supposed to love her most. Thomas stumbled back, his heel catching on a loose brick. I gave her everything. She's my property. The air in the alley seemed to turn to ice. Joon-Seok grabbed Thomas by the lapels, lifting him just enough that the man's toes scraped the wet ground. The power in Joon-Seok's grip was absolute, a silent testament to the violence he usually kept tethered. She isn't property. She's a client, Joon-Seok whispered, his voice vibrating with a terrifying calm. And she paid me in a currency you'll never understand. She gave me her trust. In exchange, I promised her the monsters would go away. I didn't tell her they'd be arrested. I didn't tell her they'd be protected by a system you've spent a decade corrupting. Joon-Seok leaned in, his gaze pinning Thomas to the brick wall. I told her the monsters had changed sides, that the things in the dark now work for her. Look around you, Thomas. There are no police coming. There are no lawyers. There's only me and the debt you owe a 6-year-old girl. He released the man, watching as Thomas slumped into the grime of the alley. Joon-Seok didn't look back as he signaled the sedan. Take him to the harbor. He doesn't need his name anymore. He doesn't need his life. He just needs to understand that from now on, he is the one who should be afraid of the dark. In the weeks that followed the rain-slicked silence of the alleyway, the world of Thomas Morgan was systematically dismantled and buried beneath a mountain of digital ash. But for Ella and her mother, Sarah, the destruction of the old world was merely the foundation for something they had never dared to imagine, a clean slate. Seo Joon-Seok sat in the back of a darkened sedan, watching through the tinted glass as a courier delivered a thick, unremarkable envelope to a small cottage 300 miles north. Inside that envelope was the alchemy of the underworld. New birth certificates, new social security numbers, and deeds to a life that had no connection to the scary papers or the man who had hidden behind them. He had used every favor owed to him, reaching into the pockets of high-ranking officials who were now more than eager to please the man who held their secrets. He didn't just move them, he erased them. Sarah Morgan became Sarah Miller, a woman with a verifiable history and a bank account filled with settlement funds from an anonymous corporate trust. Ella became a child whose school record showed nothing but high marks and a flawless attendance record. The security detail is in place, Park whispered from the driver's seat. They're local, former military. They don't know who provided the funds, only that the house is a sanctuary. Joon-Seok nodded, his gaze fixed on the small figure who had just stepped onto the cottage porch. Ella looked different. The school uniform was gone, replaced by a bright yellow sweater that stood out against the green of the trees. She looked like a child who belonged to the sunlight, not the shadows. He reached into the seat beside him and touched the worn teddy bear one last time. He had kept Barnaby, a silent reminder of the contract that had changed him. He wouldn't be following them. To stay in their lives was to keep them tethered to the very darkness he had fought to save them from. His role as the shield was over. Now, he had to become the ghost. Drive, Joon-Seok commanded softly. As the car pulled away, he saw Ella look toward the road for a fleeting second. She didn't wave, and she didn't cry. She simply stood tall, her eyes no longer calculating the distance to the nearest exit. She was safe. Joon-Seok leaned back into the velvet shadows of the car, the ink on his hands feeling a little less like a burden. He had spent a lifetime taking things from the world, but in giving Ella a name that didn't carry a weight, he felt he had finally earned a right to his own. The shadows remained his home, but for the first time, they felt like a choice rather than a prison. The office in the Dragon's Lounge was quiet once more, yet the air felt lighter, as if the shadows themselves had been scrubbed clean. Seo Joon-Seok sat at his heavy mahogany desk, the city's skyline shimmering through the glass like a sea of cold diamonds. On his wrist, his luxury watch, a masterpiece of platinum and precision, marked the time with a silent, rhythmic sweep. It was a timepiece that cost more than most people earned in a decade, a symbol of the status he had clawed out of the darkness. But his eyes were not on the watch. They were fixed on the small, battered object sitting on the polished wood in front of him. Ella had left it behind during their final meeting at the safe house. When he had tried to return it, she had pushed his hand away with a surprising, quiet strength. For the contract, she had said. Payment. He reached out, his tattooed fingers, stained by years of less honorable business, brushing the matted gray fur of Barnaby the bear. The toy was missing an eye. Its stuffing was thin in places from being held too tight during storms, and it smelled faintly of laundry detergent and old dreams. It was a piece of her soul, the only thing she had owned that was entirely hers, offered to him in exchange for her life. Joon-Seok unbuckled the platinum watch from his wrist. He laid the expensive instrument on the desk beside the bear. The watch was a machine. It measured the passage of hours he had spent building an empire of fear. But the bear measured something he had long thought himself incapable of. It measured a debt of honor, a child's trust, and the first time a human being had looked at him and seen a protector instead of a monster. He realized then that the watch was worthless. It could tell him the time, but could never tell him he was redeemed. The bear, in all its ragged, stitched-together glory, was the most valuable asset he had ever acquired. It was the physical proof that Seo Joon-Seok was no longer just a weapon of the underworld, but a shield for the innocent. He picked up the bear and tucked it carefully into the inner pocket of his suit jacket, right over his heart. He didn't put the watch back on. He left it lying on the desk, a discarded relic of a man he no longer wished to be. As he walked out of the office and into the dim hallway, his footsteps were steady. The contract was closed, the payment was received, and for the first time in his life, the boss of the Dragon's Lounge felt like a man who truly owned his own soul. The sun had barely begun to crest over the horizon when the taxi pulled away from the small cottage, leaving a trail of dust that shimmered in the morning light. Ella stood at the edge of the driveway, her new yellow backpack, the one with the sturdy straps and the smell of fresh canvas, slung over her shoulders. Beside her, Sarah gripped her hand, a soft smile finally reaching her eyes. 300 miles away, in the quiet, pre-dawn shadows of the Dragon's Lounge, Seo Joon-Seok stood by the window of his study. He wasn't looking at the ledger or the news reports of the arrest following Thomas Morgan's disappearance. He was looking at photographs sent via an encrypted link. Ella, standing in front of a red brick schoolhouse, her head held high. He reached into his pocket and pulled out Barnaby. The bear was tucked into a custom-made silk pouch now, protected from the dust and the grime of his world. He set the toy on the windowsill, facing the rising sun. "She's in," Park whispered from the doorway, his voice lacking its usual edge. First bell just rang. She didn't look back once. Joon-Seok nodded, a profound sense of closure settling over him like a heavy coat being lifted. He had spent his life believing that power was meant to be hoarded, a weapon to keep the world at bay. But as he watched the light catch the golden fur of the bear, he realized that true power was the ability to create a world where a child never had to look back in fear. Ella walked through the front doors of her new school, the scuffed shoes replaced by new ones that didn't know the rhythm of a hiding place. She sat at a desk near the window, opened her bag, and took out a clean notebook. On the first page, she didn't draw a monster or a closet. She drew a dragon, not a scary one, but one with wide wings that looked like a shield. Back in the city, Joon-Seok turned away from the window and toward his desk. He picked up his pen, but before he started his work, he adjusted the bear one last time, so he could see the sun. The contract was more than fulfilled. The debt was settled. For the first time in his life, the most dangerous man in the city was at peace, knowing that somewhere far away, the monsters had finally lost.